The impact sent Specialist Kira stumbling backward into the concrete wall of the mess hall, her shoulder blades striking the painted surface with a dull thud that echoed across the suddenly silent dining area. Colonel Bradley Thorne's knuckles were still clenched, his breathing heavy from the force he had put behind the blow that caught her across the left cheek. "Nobody moves when I'm talking to you, soldier," he snarled, his voice carrying the authority of 23 years in command positions. 17 pairs of eyes watched from nearby tables, forks suspended halfway to mouths, conversations dying mid-sentence. "This is what happens when you disrespect a superior officer," Thorne continued, stepping closer to where Kira remained against the wall, her hand touching the reddening mark on her face. The dining hall had transformed into an impromptu theater, with breakfast forgotten as soldiers witnessed what appeared to be a textbook case of rank abuse. Private Chin whispered to his table-mate, "Think she'll report it?" The response came as a quiet snort. "Report what? Nobody saw anything here." The collective understanding rippled through the witnesses. This was military hierarchy in its rawest form, where a colonel's word carried the weight of absolute authority and a specialist's complaint would disappear into bureaucratic silence. Kira straightened slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. The silence stretched longer than combat pauses, creating space that felt dangerous in its potential. Her voice, when it came, was steady and measured. "Yes, sir," she said simply, her tone carrying neither defiance nor submission, just acknowledgement. Thorne's expression shifted slightly, as if he had expected tears, protests, or the stammering apologies that usually followed his disciplinary methods. Before we continue with what happened next, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed situations where power seemed completely one-sided in your community. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez leaned toward his companion at a corner table. "Seen this before?" he muttered under his breath. "Colonel gets his point across. Soldier learns respect. Everyone moves on." His certainty reflected the prevailing wisdom about military justice. Rank protected rank, and specialists like Kira existed at the mercy of their commanding officers' moods and methods. The morning sun streamed through the mess hall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the linoleum floor, illuminating the scene with the harsh clarity of institutional fluorescence mixed with natural daylight. The smell of powdered eggs and coffee hung in the air, ordinary breakfast aromas that now seemed incongruous with the tension crackling through the space. Thorne studied Kira's face, looking for the satisfaction of seeing fear or humiliation in her expression. Instead, he found something that puzzled him. Her brown eyes held a quality he couldn't immediately identify, something that remained steady despite the physical blow and public humiliation. It wasn't the broken look he expected from someone who had just learned their place in the military hierarchy. "You're dismissed, specialist," he said finally, waving his hand in a gesture of imperial dismissal. "Return to your duties and remember this conversation." The assumption was clear. She would slink away, nurse her bruised cheek and ego, and the incident would become another story about respecting authority that would circulate through the barracks for a few days before fading into military folklore. But Kira didn't move immediately. She remained against the wall for 3 more heartbeats, her gaze steady on Thorne's face, as if memorizing details for some purpose he couldn't fathom. The colonel's confidence wavered slightly under that unwavering stare, though he couldn't articulate why a mere specialist's attention should cause him any discomfort. Then she stepped away from the wall with the fluid grace of someone completely in control of their movements, despite having just absorbed a blow that would have left most soldiers shaken. Her posture remained erect, military bearing intact, as she walked toward the exit with measured steps that suggested neither hurry nor hesitation. The witnesses watched her departure with a mixture of pity and relief that they hadn't been the target of Thorne's demonstration. "Poor girl," someone whispered. "Should have kept her mouth shut when he was talking." The consensus was immediate and unanimous. She had learned a hard lesson about military protocol, and life would return to normal once the brief drama concluded. Thorne straightened his uniform jacket and returned to his breakfast table, satisfied that order had been restored. The incident would serve as an effective reminder to other subordinates about the consequences of showing anything less than complete deference to superior officers. His reputation for maintaining discipline would be enhanced, and the specialist would think twice before displaying whatever attitude had prompted his corrective action. Outside the mess hall, Kira walked across the concrete courtyard toward the communications building, her hand no longer touching her cheek. The redness was already beginning to fade, but the memory of the blow remained sharp and clear. She had absorbed every detail of the encounter, from Thorne's precise movements to the reactions of each witness, filing the information with the methodical precision of someone trained to observe and remember. The morning air carried the sound of routine military activities. Engines starting in the motor pool, drill sergeants calling cadence in the distance, the general hum of a military installation beginning another day of operations. For everyone except Kira, this would be remembered as the morning a specialist learned to show proper respect. For Kira, it marked the beginning of something entirely different. Colonel Thorne settled back into his chair with the satisfied expression of a commander who had effectively demonstrated the proper order of military authority. The incident was already being processed in his mind as a teaching moment, the kind of decisive leadership that maintained discipline across the entire installation. He cut into his scrambled eggs with renewed appetite, confident that word of the specialist's lesson would spread through the barracks and prevent future displays of disrespect. At the table nearest the confrontation site, Corporal Jenkins leaned toward his breakfast companion. "That girl's going to think twice before stepping out of line again," he said quietly, shaking his head with the knowing expression of someone who had witnessed military justice in action. The response came as a grunt of agreement. Thorne doesn't mess around when it comes to respect. Should have seen the look on her face when his fist connected. The conversation reflected the general sentiment rippling through the mess hall. This was how things worked in the military. Officers maintained order through decisive action, and enlisted personnel learned to navigate the hierarchy with appropriate deference. The specialist had received a practical education in military protocol, and the system would continue functioning smoothly now that boundaries had been clearly re-established. Staff Sergeant Martinez pushed back from his table, coffee cup empty and breakfast finished. "These young soldiers come in thinking they can challenge authority," he commented to his table partners. "Takes a firm hand to show them how things really work around here." His words carried the weight of experience, someone who had observed countless similar interactions over his 15-year career. The specialist would adapt or find herself facing increasingly serious consequences. Thorne glanced around the dining hall, noting how conversations had resumed their normal volume and cadence. The brief disruption had been absorbed into the routine flow of military life, becoming another data point in the ongoing education of junior personnel. He had handled the situation with exactly the right combination of force and authority, demonstrating leadership principles that would maintain good order and discipline across his command. Meanwhile, Kira walked through the communications building's main corridor with the steady pace of someone executing routine duties. The building hummed with the constant activity of information processing, radio transmissions crackling from multiple stations as operators maintained contact with units across the region. She passed familiar faces who nodded respectfully, unaware of the morning's incident or its potential implications. Technical Sergeant Morrison looked up from his equipment bank as Kira approached her assigned workstation. "Morning, Vesperian," he said casually, then paused as he noticed the slight discoloration on her left cheek. "You okay?" The question carried genuine concern from a non-commissioned officer who took pride in looking after the personnel under his supervision. "Just a minor disagreement about protocol, sir," Kira replied, settling into her chair and beginning the process of logging into the secure communication systems. Her tone suggested the matter was resolved and required no further discussion. Morrison studied her profile for a moment longer, noting the calm professionalism that had always characterized her work performance, then returned his attention to the morning's transmission schedules. The communications center operated with the precision of a well-tuned instrument, each operator managing multiple channels while maintaining constant awareness of priority traffic and emergency protocols. Kira's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing databases and communication networks that connected their installation to the broader military command structure. Her clearance levels allowed access to information flows that most personnel never encountered. Back in the mess hall, the breakfast rush was beginning to wind down as soldiers finished their meals and departed for their assigned duties. The incident with the specialist had already been relegated to background conversation, another minor drama in the daily life of a military installation. Thorne finished his coffee and checked his watch, satisfied that the morning had started with an effective demonstration of proper command presence. Private Hassan cleared his table and prepared to leave for motor pool duties. "Think she'll try to file a complaint?" he asked his companion, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The response came as a laugh. "Against a colonel? She's not that stupid. Complaints from specialists disappear into paperwork, and colonels have long memories for soldiers who cause them trouble." The assessment reflected practical understanding of military hierarchy and administrative reality. Enlisted personnel learned quickly that challenging officers led to career difficulties, assignment problems, and the kind of attention that made military life significantly more challenging. The specialist had received her education and would presumably adjust her behavior accordingly. Kira's workstation displayed multiple data streams, real-time information flowing from sources across several continents. Her security clearance provided access to communication channels that operated far above the level of routine installation traffic. As she began her morning duties, her movements remained calm and methodical, showing no indication that the physical assault had affected her professional capabilities or emotional equilibrium. The morning progressed with the steady rhythm of military routine. Personnel reported to their assigned positions, equipment was checked and maintained, training schedules were executed according to established protocols. The installation functioned as designed, a complex organization where each individual contributed to the overall mission according to their rank, specialty, and security clearance level. Colonel Thorne departed the mess hall with the confident stride of a leader who had started his day by reinforcing proper standards of military conduct. The specialist would remember her lesson. Other personnel would observe the consequences of disrespectful behavior, and his reputation for maintaining discipline would be further enhanced. The morning's work had been completed successfully before his official duties even began. In the communications center, Kira completed her initial system checks and began processing routine traffic. Her fingers paused briefly over a particular communication protocol, one that existed far outside normal installation procedures. For just a moment, she considered the sequence of actions that would follow if she initiated contact through those channels. Then she returned to her standard duties. The decision apparently deferred to some future moment when conditions might require different responses. By noon, Colonel Thorne's confidence had expanded into something approaching celebration. The morning's discipline had been discussed in the officers' mess, where his peers had offered approving comments about maintaining proper standards. Major Kellerman had particularly praised his decisive handling of what could have become a morale problem if left unaddressed. These young enlisted think they can challenge authority until someone shows them reality, Kellerman had said over coffee, nodding with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated effective leadership. Thorne decided to reinforce the lesson during the afternoon equipment inspection. When he encountered Kira checking radio components in the maintenance bay, his voice carried the authority of someone whose position had been definitively established. "Specialist Vesperian," he announced loudly enough for nearby personnel to hear clearly. "I trust this morning's conversation helped clarify your understanding of proper military protocol." The maintenance bay fell silent as soldiers paused their work to observe this follow-up to the mess hall incident. Sergeant Torres exchanged glances with Corporal Nakamura, both recognizing the colonel's intention to publicly reinforce the hierarchy that had been demonstrated earlier. This was textbook command presence, ensuring that lessons learned by one individual would be understood by the entire unit. "Yes, sir," Kira replied without looking up from the frequency calibration she was performing on a field radio. Her tone remained professional and neutral, exactly the kind of subdued acknowledgement that suggested proper lesson absorption. Thorne studied her posture for signs of the appropriate deference, noting with satisfaction that she maintained focus on her assigned tasks, rather than attempting eye contact that might suggest residual defiance. The colonel moved closer, his presence creating a physical reminder of the morning's power demonstration. "I've been commanding soldiers for over 2 decades, specialist," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of extensive experience. "In that time, I've learned that clear communication prevents misunderstandings that could damage unit cohesion and operational effectiveness." The words were chosen to sound like professional mentorship, while reinforcing the message that challenges to his authority would not be tolerated. "Understood completely, sir," Kira responded, still focused on her equipment calibration procedures. Her hands moved with steady precision across the radio controls, adjusting frequencies and checking signal strength with the methodical approach of someone thoroughly familiar with communication technology. The technical competence she displayed seemed to reinforce her acceptance of the proper relationship between specialist and colonel. What the observers didn't notice was the specific equipment Kira was calibrating. The radio unit she worked on operated on frequencies that existed far outside standard installation communication protocols. Her adjustments weren't routine maintenance, but rather preparation of systems designed for contact with command levels that transcended local military hierarchy. Each frequency she set represented access to networks that most personnel would never encounter throughout their entire careers. The maintenance bay resumed normal activity levels as Thorne moved on to inspect other areas, satisfied that his authority had been publicly reaffirmed and that the specialist understood her position within the command structure. Sergeant Torres approached Kira's workstation once the colonel had departed, lowering his voice to speak confidentially. "You handling this okay, Vesperian?" The question reflected genuine concern from a non-commissioned officer who had seen similar situations develop in various directions. "Just maintaining proper military bearing, Sergeant," Kira replied, completing her frequency calibrations and beginning to pack the specialized radio equipment. Her response satisfied Torres that she was processing the morning's events appropriately and wouldn't require additional counseling or support to maintain professional standards. He nodded approvingly and returned to his own duties, confident that the situation was resolving according to established military protocols. But Kira's equipment preparation wasn't random maintenance activity. Each radio she calibrated represented a specific communication capability, carefully selected access to networks that operated according to authorities far beyond Colonel Thorne's comprehension. Her movements appeared routine to casual observers, but she was actually establishing the technical foundation for contacts that would transform the entire nature of the morning's incident. As afternoon progressed into evening, word of the mess hall confrontation had spread throughout the installation with the efficiency of military gossip networks. The story had been refined through multiple retellings, becoming a cautionary tale about respecting authority and understanding proper military hierarchy. Private Yamamoto summed up the prevailing sentiment during dinner conversation. "That specialist learned what happens when you forget your place," he told his table companions. "Colonel Thorne doesn't tolerate disrespect from anyone, regardless of their specialty or security clearance." The assessment reflected the general understanding that military rank trumped all other considerations. Technical expertise, security clearances, and specialized training were valuable, but they couldn't protect someone from the consequences of challenging a superior officer's authority. The specialist had received necessary education about how things actually worked within the military system, and order had been properly restored. In her barracks room that evening, Kira sat at her personal computer, reviewing what appeared to be routine military correspondence and training materials. Her screen displayed standard documents that any communications specialist might access during off-duty hours. but her fingers occasionally moved to specific keys in sequences that activated access to information systems existing far beyond normal personnel databases. The documents she accessed weren't visible to casual observation, but they contained contact protocols and authentication procedures that operated according to authorities extending far above installation command levels. Her security clearances provided access to networks where colonels were considered junior officers and where morning mess hall incidents could trigger responses involving general officer attention and Pentagon-level oversight. Colonel Thorne concluded his day with satisfaction about the morning's leadership demonstration and its positive effects on unit discipline. The specialist had been properly educated, other personnel had observed the consequences of inappropriate behavior, and his reputation for maintaining military standards had been enhanced. Tomorrow would begin with a command environment where proper hierarchy had been clearly established and everyone understood their position within the military structure. But while Thorne planned his next day's routine activities, Kira was preparing communications that would transform his situation in ways he couldn't imagine. Her access to networks that existed far above his comprehension level meant that morning's assault was about to receive attention from authorities whose involvement would change everything about his confidence and immunity. The quiet specialist was about to demonstrate exactly how military hierarchy actually functioned when proper channels were activated. The second morning arrived with Colonel Thorne's authority feeling more solid than ever. His demonstration of decisive leadership had generated positive feedback from his superior officers and established clear expectations throughout his command. During the morning briefing with his staff, he referenced the previous day's incident as an example of maintaining proper standards. Sometimes leadership requires making difficult decisions that reinforce military hierarchy, he told Major Brennan and Captain Foster, both of whom nodded with understanding appreciation. The breakfast hour brought another opportunity to reinforce lessons learned. When Thorne noticed Kira collecting her meal tray near the serving line, he made his approach deliberately visible to the morning crowd. Specialist Vesperian, he called out in a voice that carried across multiple tables. I trust yesterday's guidance has helped improve your understanding of appropriate military bearing. The dining hall attention focused immediately on this follow-up interaction, soldiers pausing conversations to observe how the specialist would respond to continued command emphasis on proper respect. This was military education in action, where individual lessons became collective understanding about acceptable behavior and appropriate responses to authority. Much clearer now, sir, Kira replied, maintaining the subdued tone that suggested thorough lesson absorption. Her posture remained respectfully attentive, exactly the kind of corrective behavior that demonstrated effective leadership impact. Thorne felt satisfied that his disciplinary approach had produced the desired results without requiring escalation to more serious consequences. Good to hear, he responded, then decided to expand the educational moment for broader impact. Military hierarchy exists for important reasons, specialist. When we maintain proper respect between ranks, we ensure mission effectiveness and unit cohesion. The words were delivered loudly enough that nearby personnel could absorb the leadership philosophy being demonstrated. Several soldiers exchanged glances that reflected their understanding of the ongoing dynamics. Corporal Williams whispered to his tablemate, "She's learning how things work around here." The response came as a knowing nod. Smart girl will keep her head down and avoid more attention from the colonel. The assessment represented practical wisdom about surviving military hierarchy and the importance of not drawing continued scrutiny from command authority. But what the witnesses couldn't observe was the particular equipment Kira had been working with during the night shift. Her access to the communications center during off-duty hours wasn't unusual for someone with her security clearance and technical responsibilities. However, the specific system she had activated operated far outside normal installation protocols, connecting to networks that most personnel would never encounter throughout their careers. The communications she had sent used authentication codes that existed at levels where colonel-level authority was considered routine middle management. Her messages had been routed through channels designed for situations where local command authority needed oversight from entities with broader perspective and more comprehensive understanding of military hierarchy. Each transmission represented access to decision-makers whose involvement could transform local situations in dramatic ways. Technical Sergeant Morrison approached her workstation later that morning, noticing subtle changes in the communication center's operational status. Some interesting priority traffic came through last night, he mentioned casually, though his tone suggested professional curiosity about activities occurring outside normal duty hours. The overnight communication logs showed unusual patterns that indicated contact with higher-level networks. Just routine maintenance and system checks, Sergeant, Kira replied, continuing her assigned duties with the steady professionalism that had always characterized her work performance. Her explanation satisfied Morrison's curiosity while maintaining appropriate boundaries about security-sensitive activities. He nodded and returned to his own responsibilities, confident that Kira's technical expertise and clearance levels qualified her for whatever activities she had undertaken. Meanwhile, Colonel Thorne was settling into his morning administrative routine, reviewing reports and preparing for scheduled meetings with his staff. The previous day's discipline had been properly administered. The specialist was demonstrating improved attitude, and his command environment reflected the proper order that came from decisive leadership. His calendar showed routine activities that would continue building the professional atmosphere he had worked to establish. The installation continued operating according to normal schedules, with personnel executing their assigned duties and maintaining the steady rhythm of military efficiency. Training exercises proceeded as planned. Equipment maintenance followed established protocols, and communication systems processed routine traffic that connected their installation to the broader military network. Everything appeared to function exactly as designed, but certain communication channels were beginning to carry traffic that operated far above routine installation level. Messages were being processed through networks where morning mess hall incidents could trigger responses involving authorities whose involvement would transform local command dynamics in fundamental ways. The quiet specialist's access to these systems meant that Thorne's confidence in his immunity was about to encounter realities he couldn't anticipate. During lunch, the conversation at various tables reflected continued satisfaction with how the specialist situation had been resolved. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez summarized the prevailing sentiment while discussing the morning's interactions. "That girl learned her lesson about military respect," he told his companions. "Colonel handled it exactly right, firm but fair. Shows why he's been successful as a commander." The assessment reflected broader understanding about effective military leadership and the importance of maintaining proper hierarchy. Thorne's approach had demonstrated textbook command presence, establishing clear expectations while providing opportunity for improved behavior. The specialist's submissive responses indicated that corrective action had achieved its intended results without requiring more serious consequences. But while personnel throughout the installation viewed the situation as successfully resolved, Kira was monitoring communication channels that operated according to entirely different authorities. Her security clearances provided access to networks where local command decisions could be reviewed by entities with broader jurisdiction and more comprehensive understanding of military regulations. The morning's follow-up confrontation had provided additional documentation for reports that were already generating attention far above Thorne's comprehension level. As afternoon arrived, Colonel Thorne felt increasingly confident that his leadership demonstration had produced exactly the right results. The specialist was showing proper respect. Other personnel had observed effective authority, and his command environment reflected the professional standards that came from decisive action when situations required correction. Tomorrow would bring continued routine operations within a properly ordered military hierarchy where everyone understood their position and responsibilities. Colonel Bradley Thorne's 23-year military career had been built on understanding exactly how institutional power functioned and where protective boundaries existed for officers who maintained proper command presence. His personnel file contained commendations for decisive leadership, effective unit management, and the kind of firm discipline that superior officers appreciated when evaluating promotion potential. The morning's follow-up with the specialist represented textbook authority reinforcement that would enhance his reputation throughout the regional command structure. His history with subordinate personnel reflected consistent patterns that had never generated serious consequences. 3 years earlier, a lieutenant had filed a complaint about inappropriate command methods, but the paperwork had disappeared into administrative review processes that ultimately concluded with recommendation for the lieutenant's transfer to less challenging assignment. 2 similar incidents involving enlisted personnel had been resolved through counseling sessions that emphasized proper respect for authority and understanding of military hierarchy. The system protected officers who maintained discipline, especially those whose methods produced effective results without generating publicity that might embarrass higher command levels. Thorne understood these dynamics perfectly, having observed careers advance and stagnate based on ability to manage personnel issues without creating problems for superior officers. His approach with the specialist followed established patterns that had proven successful throughout his command experience. What he couldn't comprehend was that certain personnel operated according to entirely different protective frameworks, ones that existed far above his understanding of military hierarchy and institutional power. The specialist's security clearances and technical responsibilities provided access to oversight mechanisms designed for situations where local command authority exceeded appropriate boundaries and required intervention from entities with broader jurisdiction and more comprehensive regulatory authority. Major Kellerman joined Thorne for coffee during the afternoon break, their conversation reflecting mutual satisfaction about how personnel discipline had been handled. These younger soldiers need clear guidance about military standards, Kellerman observed, stirring sugar into his cup while discussing leadership philosophy. When they understand consequences for inappropriate behavior, unit effectiveness improves across the board. The assessment represented conventional wisdom about maintaining good order and discipline within military organizations. Officers who demonstrated firm authority created environments where personnel understood expectations and operated according to established protocols. The specialist correction had been administered appropriately, producing the desired behavioral modification without requiring escalation to more serious consequences that might affect her career advancement or assignment opportunities. But while Thorne and Kellerman discussed effective leadership techniques, communication networks far above their clearance levels were processing reports that treated morning mess hall incidents as potential violations requiring immediate investigation by entities whose authority transcended local command structure. The specialist's access to these systems meant that routine disciplinary actions could trigger responses involving oversight mechanisms designed to protect personnel whose roles required special consideration. Kira spent her afternoon shift monitoring communication channels that operated according to protocols most personnel never encountered throughout their entire careers. Her workstation displayed routine installation traffic, but specific authentication codes provided access to networks where individual incidents could generate attention from authorities whose involvement would transform local command dynamics in fundamental ways. Each message she processed represented potential contact with decision-makers whose perspective operated far above colonel-level authority. The installation's administrative offices buzzed with routine afternoon activities as personnel processed paperwork, updated training records, and maintained a steady flow of bureaucratic requirements that kept military organizations functioning efficiently. Colonel Thorne reviewed his monthly reports with satisfaction, noting improvements in unit discipline and personnel performance that reflected his effective leadership approach. The specialist situation had been resolved successfully, demonstrating proper command presence without generating complications. Staff Sergeant Shun discussed the morning's interactions during equipment maintenance procedures, his comments reflecting broader personnel understanding about military hierarchy and appropriate behavior. That specialist learned an important lesson about respecting authority, he told Corporal Martinez while checking radio equipment. Colonel Thorne handled it professionally, firm enough to make his point, but not so harsh that it would damage her career prospects. The evaluation represented practical wisdom about surviving military hierarchy and the importance of understanding how institutional power functioned. Personnel who adapted quickly to command expectations found their careers progressing smoothly, while those who challenged authority discovered that military systems protected officers whose discipline maintained proper order. The specialist's submissive responses indicated she had absorbed necessary lessons about appropriate behavior. However, the communication systems Kira operated provided access to oversight mechanisms that functioned according to entirely different assumptions about accountability and appropriate use of command authority. Her security clearances connected her to networks where physical assault by superior officers triggered automatic investigation protocols involving entities whose jurisdiction extended far beyond local installation boundaries. Evening arrived, with Colonel Thorne feeling increasingly confident about his leadership demonstration and its positive effects on unit discipline. The specialist continued showing proper respect. Other personnel had observed effective authority, and his command environment reflected the professional standards that came from decisive action when situations required correction. His calendar for the following day included routine meetings and administrative activities within a properly ordered military hierarchy. But certain communication channels were processing traffic that would soon transform his situation in ways he couldn't anticipate. Messages had been transmitted through networks designed for circumstances where local command decisions required review by authorities with broader perspective and more comprehensive understanding of military regulations. The quiet specialist's connections to these systems meant that his confidence in institutional protection was about to encounter realities that operated according to entirely different assumptions about accountability. Private discussions throughout the installation continued, reflecting satisfaction with how personnel issues had been resolved. The specialist had learned appropriate lessons about military respect. The colonel had demonstrated effective leadership, and order had been restored according to established protocols. Tomorrow would begin with a command environment where proper hierarchy had been clearly established and everyone understood their position within the military structure. Yet while installation personnel viewed the situation as successfully concluded, networks far above their comprehension were generating responses that would soon arrive with the authority to override local command decisions and impose consequences that transcended anything Colonel Thorne had experienced throughout his 23-year career. The specialist's patient documentation and strategic communications were about to produce results that would demonstrate exactly how military hierarchy functioned when proper oversight mechanisms were activated. The third morning brought Colonel Thorne a level of satisfaction that bordered on triumphant vindication. His handling of the specialist situation had generated positive comments during the weekly command briefing, where his superior officers had praised his decisive approach to maintaining military standards. General Morrison had specifically mentioned the importance of firm leadership in today's military environment, noting that officers who maintained proper discipline created the foundation for operational effectiveness. Thorne decided to celebrate his successful leadership demonstration by making another public interaction with the specialist, this time during the morning formation when maximum personnel would witness the transformed dynamic between command authority and properly respectful subordinate. The entire installation would observe how effective discipline produced lasting behavioral improvement and enhanced unit cohesion. When formation concluded and personnel began moving toward their assigned duties, Thorne approached Kira with the confident stride of a commander whose authority had been definitively established. "Specialist Vesperian," he announced in a voice calculated to carry across the dispersing formation, "I want to commend you for demonstrating improved military bearing since our conversation earlier this week." The public commendation served multiple purposes, reinforcing the hierarchy that had been established while showing other personnel that proper respect was recognized and rewarded. Soldiers throughout the formation area slowed their movement to observe this follow-up to the mess hall incident, understanding that they were witnessing effective leadership in action. The specialist's submissive acceptance of correction had transformed into the kind of proper behavior that made military organizations function efficiently. "Thank you, sir," Kira replied with exactly the tone of respectful acknowledgement that confirmed successful lesson absorption. Her posture remained appropriately deferential, maintaining eye contact that showed attention without suggesting any residual defiance. Thorne studied her expression for signs of the complete behavioral transformation that validated his disciplinary approach and demonstrated effective command presence. "This is how military hierarchy produces positive results," he continued, speaking loudly enough that nearby personnel could absorb the leadership lesson being demonstrated. "When we maintain proper respect between ranks, everyone benefits from improved unit effectiveness and professional development opportunities." The words were chosen to sound like mentorship while reinforcing the power dynamic that had been conclusively established. Sergeant First Class Davidson exchanged knowing glances with Staff Sergeant Kumar, both recognizing the colonel's intention to use the specialist correction as a teaching moment for broader personnel education. "Smart leadership," Davidson whispered to his companion, "shows everyone what happens when you respect authority and what happens when you don't." The assessment reflected practical understanding about how military systems functioned and why challenging superior officers led to career difficulties. But what none of the observers could perceive was that Kira's overnight activities had been focused on completing final preparations for communications that would soon transform the entire installation's command structure. Her access to networks operating far above colonel-level authority meant that 3 days of documented incidents were about to generate responses involving entities whose jurisdiction transcended local military hierarchy in fundamental ways. The communication center had processed unusual priority traffic during the previous night's shift, messages that Technical Sergeant Morrison had noted in the overnight logs but hadn't questioned due to Kira's security clearances and technical responsibilities. The traffic patterns indicated contact with networks that operated according to authorities most installation personnel would never encounter throughout their entire careers. Colonel Thorne returned to his office with enhanced confidence about his leadership effectiveness and its positive impact on unit discipline. The specialist's public demonstration of improved behavior validated his command approach and would serve as an example for other personnel who might consider challenging established authority. His methods had produced exactly the desired results without requiring escalation to more serious consequences. The morning's administrative routine proceeded smoothly, with Thorne reviewing reports and preparing for scheduled meetings that would continue building the professional environment his decisive leadership had established. His calendar included routine activities within a command structure where proper hierarchy had been clearly demonstrated and everyone understood their position within the military organization. Meanwhile, Kira was monitoring communication channels that carried traffic existing far beyond normal installation protocols. Her workstation displayed routine communication duties, but specific authentication sequences provided access to networks where individual incidents could trigger responses involving oversight mechanisms designed to protect personnel whose roles required special consideration from authorities operating above local command jurisdiction. The messages she had transmitted used protocols designed for situations where local command authority had exceeded appropriate boundaries and required immediate intervention from entities with broader regulatory responsibility. Each communication represented documented evidence of incidents that triggered automatic investigation procedures involving authorities whose involvement would transform local command dynamics in ways that Colonel Thorne couldn't comprehend. During lunch, conversations throughout the dining facility reflected continued satisfaction with how personnel discipline had been administered and its positive effects on unit morale. Private Anderson summarized the prevailing sentiment while discussing the morning's formation activities. That specialists learned proper military respect, and the colonel showed everyone how effective leadership maintains good order and discipline. The assessment represented conventional understanding about successful military hierarchy and the importance of maintaining appropriate relationships between ranks. Officers who demonstrated firm authority created environments where personnel operated according to established protocols, while those who challenged command decisions discovered that military systems protected authority figures whose discipline maintained organizational effectiveness. But communication networks far above installation level were processing reports that treated physical assault by superior officers as serious violations requiring immediate investigation by entities whose authority operated according to entirely different assumptions about accountability and appropriate use of command power. The specialist documentation had activated oversight mechanisms that would soon produce responses involving general officer attention and Pentagon-level review procedures. Afternoon activities continued according to routine schedules, with personnel executing assigned duties and maintaining the steady rhythm of military efficiency that characterized well-managed installations. Training exercises proceeded as planned, equipment maintenance followed established protocols, and communication systems processed traffic that connected their facility to the broader military network according to normal operational requirements. Colonel Thorne concluded his day with profound satisfaction about the lasting impact of his leadership demonstration. The specialist continued showing appropriate respect. Other personnel had observed effective authority, and his command environment reflected the professional standards that came from decisive action when situations required correction. Tomorrow would bring continued routine operations within a properly ordered military hierarchy where everyone understood their responsibilities. Yet while Thorne planned routine activities and celebrated successful personnel management, networks operating far above his comprehension level were generating responses that would transform his situation in ways that would demonstrate exactly how military accountability functioned when proper oversight authorities became involved in local command decisions. The first unusual sign appeared during Thursday morning's routine administrative briefing when Major Kellerman mentioned receiving unexpected inquiries from Regional Command about recent personnel incidents. Nothing specific, he told Colonel Thorne over coffee, but they wanted confirmation that all disciplinary actions had been properly documented according to current regulations. The request seemed routine, the kind of periodic oversight that ensured installations maintained appropriate standards. Thorne felt no concern about the inquiry, confident that his handling of the specialist situation had followed established protocols and demonstrated effective leadership that superior officers would approve. His disciplinary methods had produced exactly the desired results without generating complications that might embarrass higher command levels. The documentation would reflect appropriate authority and successful behavioral modification. But what he couldn't understand was that the inquiries originated from oversight mechanisms operating far above regional command authority, entities whose jurisdiction included review of incidents involving personnel with security clearances that required special protective consideration. The questions weren't routine administrative checks, but rather preliminary investigation procedures triggered by reports that had reached decision-makers whose involvement indicated serious regulatory concerns. Technical Sergeant Morrison approached Kira's workstation during the mid-morning shift with an expression that suggested professional puzzlement about communication patterns he had observed in the overnight logs. Some interesting priority routing came through last night, he mentioned casually, though his tone indicated genuine curiosity about traffic that operated outside normal installation protocols. The authentication sequences and routing codes indicated contact with networks that most personnel never encountered. Just completing some technical certification requirements, Sergeant, Kira replied, continuing her assigned duties with the steady professionalism that had always characterized her work performance. Her explanation satisfied Morrison's curiosity while maintaining appropriate security boundaries about activities that required special clearance levels and operated according to protocols that transcended local administrative oversight. The communications center continued processing routine traffic, but certain channels were carrying messages that represented responses to the reports Kira had transmitted through networks designed for situations where local command authority had exceeded appropriate boundaries. Each incoming transmission indicated growing attention from entities whose involvement would transform the installation's command structure in fundamental ways. Colonel Thorne spent his morning reviewing personnel files and preparing routine reports, his confidence undiminished by the regional command inquiries that Major Kellerman had mentioned. Military bureaucracy generated constant requests for documentation and clarification, most of which represented administrative requirements rather than actual investigations. His handling of the specialist situation would withstand any scrutiny because it had followed established leadership principles. During lunch, conversation at the officers' table reflected continued satisfaction with how personnel discipline had been administered and its positive effects on unit morale. Captain Foster praised Thorne's approach while discussing effective leadership techniques. That specialist has shown marked improvement in military bearing since the correction, he observed, noting the behavioral transformation that validated decisive command presence. The entire unit benefits when proper hierarchy is clearly established. But while installation personnel viewed the situation as successfully resolved, communication networks far above their comprehension were processing responses that indicated serious concern from authorities whose involvement would soon override local command decisions. The specialists' access to oversight mechanisms had activated investigation procedures that operated according to entirely different assumptions about accountability and appropriate use of military authority. The afternoon brought additional signs that routine administrative oversight was developing into something more significant. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez mentioned receiving unusual requests from personnel administration about documentation of recent disciplinary actions. They want copies of all incident reports from the past week, he told his colleagues during equipment maintenance procedures. Seems like someone higher up is conducting some kind of review process. The requests represented preliminary investigation activities that preceded more direct intervention from oversight authorities, though installation personnel interpreted them as routine administrative requirements rather than indicators of serious regulatory concern. Military bureaucracy generated constant documentation requests, and most personnel assumed the inquiries reflected normal command oversight rather than investigation procedures triggered by reports of inappropriate conduct. Kira monitored communication channels that carried traffic indicating rapid escalation of attention from entities whose authority operated far above colonel-level jurisdiction. Her security clearances provided access to networks where individual incidents involving personnel with special protective status could trigger immediate investigation procedures involving general officer attention and Pentagon-level review mechanisms. The messages flowing through these channels represented responses to her documented reports about physical assault by superior officers, incidents that required immediate intervention by authorities whose jurisdiction transcended local command structure. Each transmission indicated growing concern from oversight entities whose involvement would soon produce consequences that Colonel Thorne couldn't anticipate or prevent through normal institutional protection mechanisms. Evening arrived with subtle changes in the installation's administrative rhythm that suggested increased attention from outside oversight entities. Personnel throughout various departments had received requests for documentation and clarification about recent activities, creating an atmosphere of heightened scrutiny that some interpreted as routine inspection preparation, while others sensed something more significant developing. Colonel Thorne concluded his day without recognizing the significance of the administrative inquiries and documentation requests that had characterized the afternoon's activities. His confidence in institutional protection remained intact, based on 23 years of experience with military hierarchy and successful navigation of personnel issues that had never generated serious consequences for his career advancement. But communication networks operating far above his comprehension level were generating responses that would soon arrive with the authority to override local command decisions and impose accountability that transcended anything he had experienced throughout his military career. The quiet specialist's patient documentation and strategic communications were about to produce results that would demonstrate exactly how military oversight functioned when proper authorities became involved in local command situations. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of consequences that would transform not only Colonel Thorne's situation, but the entire installation's understanding of how military accountability operated when personnel with special protective status reported incidents to oversight mechanisms designed to ensure appropriate use of command authority throughout the military hierarchy. Friday morning arrived with an acceleration of administrative activity that began to concern even Colonel Thorne's experienced understanding of military bureaucracy. The installation's communication center had processed priority traffic throughout the night that Technical Sergeant Morrison described as unusual in both volume and routing complexity. "These aren't routine messages," he told his morning shift personnel, noting authentication sequences that indicated contact with command levels far above normal installation oversight. Major Kellerman approached Thorne during the early morning briefing with information that suggested the previous day's inquiries had evolved into something more significant than routine administrative oversight. "Regional Command wants a complete review of all personnel actions from the past month," he reported, his tone reflecting growing concern about the scope and intensity of attention their installation was receiving from higher authorities. The request represented a dramatic escalation from routine documentation requirements to comprehensive investigation procedures that indicated serious concern from oversight entities operating above regional command level. Thorne felt his first genuine unease about the situation, though he remained confident that his disciplinary methods had followed appropriate protocols and would withstand any scrutiny from superior officers. But what he couldn't comprehend was that the investigation had already moved far beyond regional command authority to entities whose jurisdiction included oversight of incidents involving personnel with security clearances that required special protective consideration. The specialist reports had activated oversight mechanisms designed to ensure appropriate use of command authority throughout the military hierarchy, triggering responses that operated according to entirely different assumptions about accountability. The morning formation proceeded with unusual tension as personnel throughout the installation sensed the heightened administrative activity and increased scrutiny from outside entities. Conversations reflected growing awareness that routine oversight had developed into something more serious. Though most soldiers interpreted the situation as preparation for inspection rather than investigation of specific incidents. Sergeant First Class Davidson exchanged concerned glances with Staff Sergeant Kumar during equipment checks, both recognizing that the administrative requests and documentation requirements indicated attention from authorities whose involvement suggested potential problems for local command. "Something's got higher-ups interested in our operations," Davidson whispered to his companion, noting the communication patterns that exceeded normal oversight procedures. Kira continued her assigned duties in the communication center while monitoring channels that carried traffic indicating rapid escalation of investigation procedures involving entities whose authority operated far above installation level. Her access to these networks provided real-time awareness of responses being generated by oversight mechanisms that would soon produce direct intervention in local command decisions. The messages flowing through secure channels represented preparation for consequences that would transform the installation's command structure in ways that personnel couldn't anticipate. Each transmission indicated growing concern from authorities whose involvement would override local institutional protection and impose accountability that transcended normal military hierarchy. By mid-morning, the administrative pressure had intensified to levels that even experienced personnel recognized as extraordinary. Captain Foster mentioned receiving requests for documentation that extended beyond recent personnel actions to comprehensive review of command decisions and disciplinary procedures. "They want everything," he told Colonel Thorne during a hastily arranged meeting, his expression reflecting genuine concern about the scope of investigation that was developing. The requests represented systematic preparation for oversight intervention that operated according to authorities whose jurisdiction included protection of personnel with special status and review of incidents that violated appropriate use of command power. Thorne's confidence began showing signs of strain as he recognized that routine administrative oversight had evolved into comprehensive investigation procedures. But he still couldn't understand that the investigation originated from entities whose authority transcended anything he had encountered throughout his 23-year career. Oversight mechanisms designed for situations where local command decisions required immediate intervention by authorities with broader regulatory responsibility and more comprehensive understanding of appropriate military conduct. The communication center processed increasing volumes of priority traffic that indicated preparation for direct intervention by oversight entities operating far above colonel-level jurisdiction. Technical Sergeant Morrison noted unusual routing patterns and authentication sequences that suggested contact with command levels most installation personnel never encountered throughout their entire careers. During lunch, conversations throughout the dining facility reflected growing awareness that extraordinary attention was being focused on their installation from outside authorities. Personnel exchanged theories about inspection preparation and administrative review, though none suspected that individual disciplinary incidents could trigger investigation procedures involving general officer attention and Pentagon-level oversight mechanisms. Private Chin voiced the prevailing uncertainty while discussing the morning's unusual activities. "Something big is happening, but nobody knows what," he told his table mates, noting the communication patterns and documentation requests that exceeded normal administrative requirements. The atmosphere throughout the installation had shifted from routine operations to heightened anticipation of significant developments. Colonel Thorne spent his afternoon reviewing personnel files and command decisions with growing unease about the comprehensive nature of investigation that was clearly developing beyond routine oversight procedures. His disciplinary methods had always followed established protocols and produced effective results, but the intensity of attention from higher authorities suggested scrutiny that transcended normal administrative review. The installation's routine operations continued according to established schedules, but the underlying atmosphere reflected awareness that extraordinary oversight was being applied to their activities from entities whose involvement indicated potential consequences for local command decisions. Personnel throughout various departments had received requests for documentation that suggested systematic investigation rather than routine inspection preparation. Evening brought additional signs that investigation procedures were escalating toward direct intervention by oversight authorities whose jurisdiction operated far above regional command level. Communication traffic continued indicating preparation for consequences that would soon transform the installation's command structure according to oversight mechanisms that most personnel couldn't comprehend. Kira monitored networks that carried messages representing responses to her documented reports about inappropriate use of command authority, incidents that had triggered automatic investigation procedures involving entities whose involvement would demonstrate exactly how military accountability functioned when proper oversight mechanisms were activated. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of consequences that would override local institutional protection and impose accountability that transcended normal military hierarchy. Saturday morning brought a level of administrative chaos that shattered Colonel Thorne's remaining confidence in routine explanations for the extraordinary attention their installation was receiving. The communication center had processed priority traffic throughout the night that required immediate command attention. Messages that Technical Sergeant Morrison described as operating through channels he had never encountered in 15 years of communication operations. Major Kellerman arrived at Thorne's office before normal duty hours with information that indicated the investigation had escalated far beyond regional command oversight to entities whose involvement suggested serious regulatory violations. "Pentagon wants complete personnel records for the entire installation," he reported, his voice reflecting the gravity of attention that could only mean potential consequences for command authority at multiple levels. The request represented systematic preparation for oversight intervention that operated according to authorities whose jurisdiction included comprehensive review of command decisions and immediate correction of inappropriate conduct by superior officers. Thorne felt genuine alarm for the first time, recognizing that Pentagon-level attention indicated investigation procedures that could override local institutional protection and impose accountability he had never experienced. But what terrified him was the growing realization that this level of oversight attention couldn't be generated by routine administrative concerns or minor personnel issues. Pentagon involvement indicated serious violations that had triggered investigation procedures designed for situations where local command authority had exceeded appropriate boundaries and required immediate intervention by entities with broader regulatory responsibility. The morning briefing proceeded with unprecedented tension as installation personnel struggled to maintain routine operations while processing the implications of systematic investigation by authorities whose involvement indicated potential consequences for the entire command structure. Conversations reflected growing awareness that extraordinary oversight was being applied to their activities from entities operating far above normal military hierarchy. Staff Sergeant Chun approached his colleagues during equipment maintenance with information that suggested the investigation was focusing on specific incidents rather than general administrative review. They want detailed reports about any unusual disciplinary actions from the past week, he told Corporal Martinez, noting the precision of requests that indicated investigation of particular events rather than routine inspection procedures. The targeting represented systematic documentation of incidents that had triggered oversight mechanisms designed to protect personnel with special status and ensure appropriate use of command authority throughout the military hierarchy. Each request indicated growing evidence of regulatory violations that required immediate correction by authorities whose involvement would transform local command dynamics in fundamental ways. Kira continued monitoring communication channels that carried traffic indicating preparation for direct intervention by oversight entities whose authority operated far above installation level. Her access to these networks provided real-time awareness of investigation procedures that would soon produce consequences involving general officer attention and systematic review of command decisions that had violated appropriate military conduct. The messages flowing through secure channels represented responses to her documented reports about physical assault by superior officers, incidents that required immediate intervention by authorities whose jurisdiction transcended local command structure. Each transmission indicated preparation for accountability measures that would demonstrate exactly how military oversight functioned when proper authorities became involved in local command situations. By noon, the administrative pressure had reached levels that overwhelmed normal installation operations as personnel throughout various departments struggled to process comprehensive documentation requests that exceeded anything they had encountered throughout their careers. Captain Foster described the situation as systematic investigation rather than routine oversight, noting the precision and scope of attention that indicated serious concern from authorities operating above regional command level. Colonel Thorne spent his afternoon reviewing his career and command decisions with growing panic about consequences he couldn't prevent through normal institutional protection mechanisms. His understanding of military hierarchy had always included confidence that officers who maintained discipline would receive support from superior authorities, but Pentagon-level investigation indicated oversight that operated according to entirely different assumptions about accountability. The installation's communication systems processed increasing volumes of priority traffic that indicated immediate preparation for direct intervention by oversight entities whose involvement would override local command decisions and impose consequences that transcended normal military hierarchy. Technical Sergeant Morrison noted authentication sequences and routing patterns that suggested contact with authorities most personnel would never encounter throughout their entire careers. During the afternoon shift change, conversations throughout the installation reflected unprecedented awareness that extraordinary oversight was being applied to their activities from entities whose involvement indicated potential consequences for command authority at multiple levels. Personnel exchanged theories about the investigation's focus and scope, though most couldn't comprehend that individual disciplinary incidents could trigger systematic review by Pentagon-level oversight mechanisms. Private Anderson voiced the growing concern while discussing the day's unusual activities with his colleagues. "This isn't inspection preparation," he told his companions, noting the communication patterns and documentation requests that indicated comprehensive investigation rather than routine administrative review. "Something serious happened, and higher authorities are taking direct action to address it." The assessment represented growing installation-wide awareness that routine oversight had evolved into systematic investigation by entities whose authority operated far above normal military hierarchy. Personnel throughout various departments recognized that extraordinary attention was being focused on their activities, though most couldn't understand the connection between recent disciplinary incidents and Pentagon-level investigation procedures. Evening brought additional signs that investigation procedures were approaching direct intervention by oversight authorities whose jurisdiction included immediate correction of inappropriate command conduct and protection of personnel with special protective status. Communication traffic continued, indicating preparation for consequences that would soon transform the installation's command structure according to oversight mechanisms that operated beyond local institutional protection. Kira monitored networks that carried messages representing final preparation for intervention by entities whose involvement would demonstrate exactly how military accountability functioned when proper oversight authorities became involved in situations where local command decisions had violated appropriate use of military power. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of consequences that would override normal hierarchy and impose accountability that transcended anything Colonel Thorne had experienced throughout his career. The installation prepared for sleep with unprecedented tension as personnel throughout various departments sensed that extraordinary developments were approaching, though most couldn't comprehend the scope of transformation that oversight intervention would bring to their command structure and understanding of how military accountability operated when proper authorities became involved in local command situations. Sunday arrived with an atmosphere of impending crisis that permeated every corner of the installation as personnel struggled to comprehend the extraordinary level of oversight attention that had transformed their routine operations into systematic investigation by authorities operating far above normal military hierarchy. Colonel Thorne hadn't slept, spending the night reviewing every command decision and disciplinary action from the past month, while trying to understand how routine personnel management had triggered Pentagon-level investigation procedures. The morning communications center processed priority traffic that Technical Sergeant Morrison described as unprecedented in both volume and authority level. Messages that required immediate command attention and indicated preparation for direct intervention by oversight entities whose involvement would transform the installation's entire command structure. These aren't requests anymore, he told his staff with obvious concern. They're preparations for immediate action by authorities I've never encountered. Major Kellerman arrived at Thorne's office with information that shattered any remaining hope that administrative explanation could resolve the investigation that was clearly approaching its conclusion. 3 general officers are en route, he reported, his voice reflecting the gravity of attention that indicated systematic review of command authority and immediate correction of regulatory violations. Estimated arrival is 1,400 hours. The announcement represented the culmination of investigation procedures that had escalated from routine oversight to comprehensive review by entities whose authority included immediate intervention in situations where local command decisions had violated appropriate military conduct. Thorne felt complete panic as he realized that general officer attention indicated consequences that would override any institutional protection he had relied upon throughout his career. But what terrified him most was the growing understanding that 3 general officers didn't coordinate simultaneous visits for routine administrative concerns or minor personnel issues. This level of direct intervention indicated serious violations that had triggered oversight mechanisms designed for situations where immediate correction was required to protect personnel with special status and ensure appropriate use of command authority throughout the military hierarchy. The installation's morning formation proceeded with unprecedented tension as personnel throughout various departments sensed that extraordinary developments were approaching, though most couldn't comprehend the scope of transformation that general officer intervention would bring to their command structure and understanding of military accountability. Conversations reflected awareness that something fundamental was about to change in ways that transcended normal military operations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached his colleagues during equipment maintenance with information that suggested the investigation had identified specific incidents requiring immediate attention from oversight authorities. They want detailed witness statements about any physical confrontations involving command personnel, he told Corporal Nakamura, noting the precision of requests that indicated investigation of particular events rather than general administrative review. The targeting represented systematic documentation of incidents that had triggered oversight mechanisms designed to ensure appropriate use of command authority and protect personnel whose roles required special consideration from entities operating above local institutional protection. Each request indicated preparation for accountability measures that would demonstrate exactly how military oversight functioned when proper authorities became involved in command situations. Kira continued monitoring communication channels that carried traffic indicating final preparation for direct intervention by the three general officers whose authority would soon override local command decisions and impose consequences that Colonel Thorne couldn't prevent through normal institutional protection mechanisms. Her access to these networks provided real-time awareness of the systematic response that her documented reports had generated through oversight entities operating far above installation level. The messages flowing through secure channels represented the culmination of investigation procedures triggered by her reports about physical assault by superior officers, incidents that required immediate intervention by authorities whose jurisdiction transcended local command structure. Each transmission indicated preparation for accountability measures that would transform the installation's understanding of how military hierarchy actually functioned when proper oversight mechanisms were activated. By noon, the administrative pressure had reached critical levels as personnel throughout the installation struggled to process the implications of imminent general officer intervention in their command structure. Captain Foster described the situation as unprecedented in his military experience, noting that three general officers coordinating simultaneous arrival indicated oversight attention that operated according to authorities he had never encountered. Colonel Thorne spent his final hours of command authority reviewing 23 years of military service while recognizing that his understanding of institutional protection had been fundamentally flawed. His confidence in military hierarchy had always included assumptions that officers who maintained discipline would receive support from superior authorities. But the approaching intervention indicated oversight that operated according to entirely different principles about accountability and appropriate conduct. The installation's communication systems processed final volumes of priority traffic that indicated immediate preparation for systematic intervention by oversight entities whose involvement would demonstrate exactly how military accountability functioned when personnel with special protective status reported incidents to authorities operating far above local command jurisdiction. Technical Sergeant Morrison noted authentication sequences that suggested coordination between command levels most personnel would never encounter throughout their entire careers. During the final hours before general officer arrival, conversations throughout the installation reflected unprecedented awareness that extraordinary transformation was approaching their command structure from entities whose authority would override normal military hierarchy and impose consequences that transcended local institutional protection. Personnel exchanged final theories about the investigation's focus and scope, though most still couldn't comprehend the connection between recent disciplinary incidents and systematic intervention by Pentagon-level oversight mechanisms. Private Hassan voiced the installation-wide tension while discussing the approaching developments with his colleagues. Whatever happened here triggered attention from the highest levels, he told his companions, noting the coordination and preparation that indicated comprehensive review rather than routine inspection procedures. Someone with serious connections reported something that couldn't be ignored or covered up through normal channels. The assessment represented growing understanding that routine personnel management had triggered systematic investigation by entities whose authority operated far above normal military hierarchy. Though most personnel still couldn't comprehend that individual incidents involving physical assault could generate oversight attention requiring immediate intervention by 3 general officers operating according to Pentagon-level jurisdiction. Evening approached with the installation preparing for transformation that would demonstrate exactly how military accountability functioned when proper oversight authorities became involved in situations where local command decisions had violated appropriate use of military power and protection of personnel with special status requiring immediate intervention by entities whose jurisdiction transcended normal institutional protection mechanisms. At exactly 1400 hours, 3 black sedans with military escort vehicles arrived at the installation's main gate with the kind of coordinated precision that indicated systematic intervention by authorities operating far above normal command hierarchy. The convoy proceeded directly to the command building without stopping for routine security procedures, their movement creating an atmosphere of unprecedented urgency that transformed the installation's entire operational rhythm. General Patricia Hawkins emerged from the lead vehicle with the bearing of someone whose authority transcended anything installation personnel had encountered throughout their careers. Her presence was followed by General Marcus Chun and General Sarah Whitfield, 3 officers whose coordinated arrival indicated oversight attention that operated according to Pentagon-level jurisdiction and immediate intervention protocols designed for serious regulatory violations. Colonel Thorne watched from his office window as the 3 general officers approached the command building, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized that 23 years of military service had not prepared him for accountability measures that operated beyond institutional protection he had always assumed would shield appropriate command authority. His career was ending in ways he had never imagined possible. The installation's personnel observed the general officer arrival with expressions of stunned disbelief, conversations stopping mid-sentence as soldiers throughout various departments recognized that extraordinary intervention was taking place according to authorities whose involvement indicated consequences that would transform their understanding of military hierarchy and command accountability. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez whispered to his companion while watching the convoy's arrival, "3 generals don't coordinate visits for routine matters." His assessment reflected growing installation-wide awareness that systematic intervention was taking place according to oversight mechanisms that operated far above normal military jurisdiction and indicated serious violations requiring immediate correction. Within minutes of their arrival, the 3 general officers had established command authority that superseded all local hierarchy and began implementing investigation procedures that operated according to comprehensive oversight protocols. General Hawkins assumed direct control of installation operations, while Generals Chun and Whitfield initiated systematic review of command decisions and personnel actions that had triggered Pentagon-level investigation procedures. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Colonel Thorne found himself summoned to the command conference room, where he faced 3 general officers whose authority represented oversight mechanisms he had never encountered and whose jurisdiction included immediate correction of inappropriate command conduct. General Hawkins addressed him with the kind of cold professionalism that indicated predetermined conclusions about regulatory violations. "Colonel Thorne," she began, her voice carrying the weight of systematic investigation and documented evidence, "you are hereby relieved of command pending comprehensive review of incidents involving physical assault of subordinate personnel." The words hit him like physical blows, each syllable representing the collapse of institutional protection he had believed would shield appropriate disciplinary authority. The relief of command represented immediate consequences that operated according to oversight mechanisms designed to protect personnel with special status and ensure appropriate use of military authority throughout the hierarchy. Thorne's understanding of military protection had been fundamentally flawed, based on assumptions that didn't account for personnel whose roles required special consideration from entities operating above local institutional jurisdiction. General Chun stepped forward with documentation that represented systematic preparation for accountability measures that would demonstrate exactly how military oversight functioned when proper authorities became involved in command situations. The evidence includes witness statements, video surveillance, and communication records that establish a pattern of inappropriate conduct requiring immediate intervention. He stated with the precision of someone whose investigation had been thorough and comprehensive. Meanwhile, installation personnel throughout various departments observed the systematic dismantling of their command structure as the three general officers implemented oversight procedures that operated according to authorities most soldiers had never encountered. Conversations reflected stunned recognition that extraordinary accountability was being imposed through mechanisms that transcended normal military hierarchy and institutional protection. Technical Sergeant Morrison watched from the communication center as military police personnel began securing Colonel Thorne's office and personal effects under direct supervision of the general officers. This is what happens when someone with serious connections reports inappropriate conduct, he told his staff, finally understanding the connection between Specialist Vesperian's patient documentation and the systematic intervention that was transforming their installation. The realization rippled through personnel who had witnessed the mess hall incident and its aftermath, creating sudden understanding that the quiet specialist's access to oversight mechanisms had activated investigation procedures that operated far above anything they had comprehended. Her security clearances and communication capabilities had provided direct connection to entities whose authority included immediate intervention in situations involving inappropriate command conduct. Kira continued her assigned duties in the communication center while monitoring channels that carried real-time coordination between the three general officers and Pentagon-level oversight entities whose involvement represented systematic response to her documented reports. The accountability measures being implemented demonstrated exactly how military hierarchy functioned when personnel with special protective status reported violations to proper authorities. General Whitfield addressed installation personnel through the emergency communication system, her announcement creating installation-wide awareness of the transformation taking place in their command structure. This installation is now under direct oversight, pending comprehensive review of command practices and personnel protection protocols, she stated, her words carrying the authority of systematic intervention by entities whose jurisdiction transcended local institutional protection. The announcement represented official acknowledgement that routine personnel management had triggered oversight attention, requiring immediate intervention by authorities operating according to Pentagon-level jurisdiction and comprehensive review of command decisions that had violated appropriate military conduct. During the afternoon, military police personnel escorted Colonel Thorne from the installation under direct supervision of the three general officers, his departure creating visible demonstration of accountability measures that operated beyond institutional protection he had relied upon throughout his career. Personnel throughout various departments watched his removal with expressions of shocked recognition that military hierarchy included oversight mechanisms they had never comprehended. The systematic dismantling of Thorne's command authority represented immediate consequences for inappropriate conduct that had been documented through communication channels operating far above local jurisdiction. His relief represented demonstration of how military accountability functioned when proper oversight authorities became involved in situations where command decisions had violated appropriate use of military power and protection of personnel with special status. The installation's transformation continued throughout the evening as the three general officers implemented comprehensive reforms that would prevent future incidents and ensure appropriate protection for personnel whose roles required special consideration from oversight authorities operating above local command jurisdiction. General Hawkins established new command protocols while Generals Chun and Whitfield conducted systematic interviews with personnel who had witnessed inappropriate conduct. By morning, the entire installation understood that extraordinary accountability had been imposed through oversight mechanisms that operated according to Pentagon-level authority and comprehensive review of command practices. Personnel throughout various departments recognized that military hierarchy included protection systems they had never comprehended, ones designed to ensure appropriate use of command authority and immediate intervention when violations required correction. Specialist Kira Vesperian received official recognition for her professional conduct and appropriate use of oversight channels that had activated investigation procedures designed to protect personnel with special status. General Hawkins personally commended her patience and systematic documentation that had provided authorities with comprehensive evidence necessary for immediate intervention in situations involving inappropriate command conduct. The commendation represented official acknowledgement that her security clearances and communication capabilities had provided proper connection to entities whose authority included protection of personnel whose roles required special consideration from oversight mechanisms operating far above local institutional jurisdiction. Her access to these networks had demonstrated exactly how military accountability functioned when appropriate authorities became involved. Technical Sergeant Morrison approached Kira's workstation with renewed respect for capabilities he had observed but never fully comprehended. "Those communication protocols you were using operated at levels I didn't recognize," he told her with obvious admiration for technical expertise that had provided direct connection to oversight entities whose involvement had transformed their installation's command structure. The installation's personnel gradually understood that the quiet specialist patient responses to inappropriate conduct had represented strategic documentation rather than submissive acceptance of command abuse. Her access to oversight mechanisms had provided immediate connection to authorities whose jurisdiction included comprehensive review and correction of violations that exceeded appropriate use of military power. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez summarized the transformation during morning formation, his words reflecting installation-wide recognition of accountability measures that had been imposed through oversight authorities operating far above normal military hierarchy. "We learned that military protection works both ways," he told his colleagues, noting that personnel with special status had access to intervention mechanisms designed to ensure appropriate command conduct. The new command structure established by the three general officers implemented protocols that would prevent future incidents while ensuring appropriate protection for all personnel, regardless of their security clearances or communication capabilities. General Chun announced comprehensive training programs designed to educate command personnel about proper use of authority and recognition of oversight mechanisms that operated above local institutional jurisdiction. During the afternoon, personnel throughout the installation reflected on the systematic intervention that had demonstrated exactly how military accountability functioned when proper authorities became involved in situations where local command decisions had violated appropriate conduct. Conversations reflected transformed understanding of hierarchy that included protection systems operating far above their previous comprehension. Private Hassan voiced the prevailing sentiment while discussing the week's extraordinary developments with his colleagues. "That specialist had connections we couldn't imagine," he told his companions, recognizing that her patient documentation had provided direct access to oversight entities whose authority included immediate intervention and comprehensive review of command practices. The assessment represented installation-wide acknowledgement that military hierarchy included oversight mechanisms designed to protect personnel whose roles required special consideration and ensure appropriate use of command authority throughout the military structure. The quiet specialist capabilities had provided demonstration of how these systems functioned when activated through proper channels. Kira continued her assigned duties in the communication center while monitoring channels that carried coordination between installation command and Pentagon-level oversight entities whose involvement would ensure continued appropriate conduct and protection for all personnel. Her role represented ongoing connection to authorities whose jurisdiction included comprehensive review and immediate intervention when situations required correction. The evening brought installation-wide recognition that extraordinary transformation had taken place through accountability measures that operated according to oversight mechanisms most personnel had never encountered. The systematic intervention had demonstrated that military hierarchy included protection systems designed to ensure appropriate use of command authority and immediate correction when violations required attention from entities operating above local institutional jurisdiction. General Hawkins addressed installation personnel through the communication system, her announcement creating official acknowledgement of the transformation that had taken place in their command structure. This installation now operates according to protocols that ensure appropriate protection for all personnel and proper use of command authority at every level, she stated, her words carrying the weight of comprehensive reform implemented through Pentagon-level oversight. The announcement represented establishment of new standards that would prevent future incidents while maintaining the kind of professional environment where personnel could execute their duties without concern about inappropriate use of command authority or violation of protection mechanisms designed to ensure appropriate military conduct. As the week concluded, personnel throughout the installation understood that they had witnessed demonstration of how military accountability functioned when proper oversight authorities became involved in situations requiring immediate intervention and comprehensive review. The quiet specialist patient documentation had activated mechanisms that most soldiers would never encounter, but which represented essential protection systems within military hierarchy. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment or character, or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when facing impossible odds. The installation prepared for continued operations under new command protocols that ensured appropriate protection for all personnel while maintaining the professional standards that came from proper use of military authority and recognition of oversight mechanisms designed to prevent inappropriate conduct and ensure immediate intervention when situations required correction by entities operating according to Pentagon-level jurisdiction and comprehensive accountability measures.